Alright, so for our last lecture in this module, we're going to talk about the West. We're not really going to talk too much about the history of the West. We'll cover that later, but we're going to talk about the West as an idea and a concept in American history. So, a few key questions. How was the West traditionally depicted in American history? And second, how has the West contributed to our understanding of American identity? So first let's talk about traditional views of the American West. This is the cowboy Indian idea, right? The John Wayne movie. And this idea promulgates the vision of the West as empty, desolate, until whites got there, right? And settled it and made it beautiful. Um, there may have been some Native American groups that the cowboys had to fight against, right? And this makes essentially Native Americans part of the environment, right? The landscape that had to be tamed and brought into subjugation. Um, and then also, there may have also been, a few Spanish and Mexican settlements here, but those are mostly ignored within the idea of the cowboy versus Indian. There's also this idea of the rugged individualist, right? The cowboy, the strong white man who can ride a horse, herds cattle, uses a gun, builds his own home, makes his own farm. This is the rugged individual, right? The idea that you can do it if you work hard enough and you don't need any help if you're strong enough. And this goes back to the idea of social Darwinism, right, that we talked about with the Gilded Age. Uh, the smart, the fast, the strong, the good looking, are going to rise to the top naturally, while the rest of us, the riffraff, the slow, the lazy, and the dim-witted, are going to remain at the bottom. So this tradition divides the history of the country into two parts: the pre-frontier and post-frontier. The Old West was a distinct place with its own history until the two coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific, were connected by white settlements and the railroad, and then the West became part of the rest of the country. And so this idea comes from a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. Um, Turner corralled Western history under the idea of the frontier. In 1893, he gave a speech on the significance of the frontier in American history. He argued that it was the frontier, with the challenges that it presented to civilization, that made the country into what it was. Distinctive American qualities like individualism, democracy, economic mobility were all a result of the continual push west. As a result of Turner's thesis, the West became not so much a place, but an idea represented, which represented the belief that if someone was strong enough and smart enough, then they could achieve success. Now, this was definitely true to some extent. However, Turner's thesis did come with some problems. Number one, everything about the West fits into the white male category, right? It's very ethnocentric and very nationalistic. Women and minorities are pretty much absent. He interpreted the past in light of his own events, his own contemporary events, which is fairly common for historians to do. And also, it's pretty arbitrary, right? There's no dividing line right down the middle of the country that says frontier on it, right? So where does the frontier start? Where does it end? And when's the cutoff date? When does the frontier actually disappear? So it's pretty arbitrary. But despite all of this, his ideas continued well into the 20th century. He was a very popular historian. Um, we now know, though, that the West was much more complex. Firstly, it was a place of conquest. Violence was prevalent as people continually fought against each other for control over natural resources. Um, they fought against the land. They fought against each other, and it was all about bringing resources in under control. Um, the West was also a meeting place. It was much more diverse than the South. There were the American whites, but there were also African Americans. Asians, Asian Americans, Native Americans, which are also very diverse. They have their own groups within the Native American label, we'll call it, and and you also had Spanish and Mexicans and Spanish and Mexican Americans that were all living in the West. And racism was extremely prevalent throughout. Many groups of whites tried to uphold what they considered to be their concept of American ideals. They hated Asian Americans. So Californians wanted to throw them out completely. In fact, there's one quote here I wanted to share with you. It said from California, it said they call us a mob. It was a mob that fought the Battle of Lexington and a mob that threw the tea overboard in Boston Harbor, but they backed their principles. I want to see every Chinaman, white or yellow, thrown out of this state. So there's that for you. And then in regard to African Americans, here's one from Oregon. The object is to keep clear of this most troublesome class of population. We are in a new world, under most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of these great evils that have so much afflicted the United States and other countries. So Oregonians just wanted to keep African Americans out because they thought that by doing that, they would avoid conflict and tension, right? So basically, they're promoting segregation from the whole state. So additionally, women and children were also very important to the settlement of the West. And there were fringe groups like the Mormons who settled in Utah. They came to the West looking for safety and freedom. And the unique thing about Mormons is that they had been driven out of places like Missouri, Illinois, and Ohio, and basically left the country and came to northern Mexico, which was, Utah was part of Mexico when they arrived. But they were white and they were American, and yet they were pushed out and fought against. Um, and one author says that the Mormons, because of their novel religion, were and their occasional experiments with communitarianism and their ability to vote in bloc, their very separatism, made them targets for suspicion and hostility. And so they basically did not fit the American ideal, the American Protestant ideal. And polygamy didn't help them either. They practiced polygamy throughout the 19th century. And in fact, the Republican platform in 1856 was to, here's the quote, "It is the duty of Congress to prohibit in territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery." So the Republican Party, which we know was founded to combat slavery, was also founded to combat polygamy, or the Mormons. And so this led to a 30-year period of civil disobedience between Mormon polygamists and the rest of the country. And this 30-year period of civil disobedience is the longest of any group in the history of the country. However, Mormons eventually ended polygamy, which basically ended the country's hostility towards them. And so this shows that it does pay to be white and American. So the West was it was a place where lines of authority were drawn, mostly over resources. But this leads to a cultural dominance. If you have one culture dominating the other, then they can dictate the terms of what it means to be American. So how does this play into American history? The West offers examples of the role of American capitalism, religion, and race relations. The West perpetuated a belief that man can control the natural world, and there's numerous examples through the history of the West of the importance of the human relationship with the environment. So you get a little bit of environmental history there. So in summary, you can see here, many have believed the West was the place where one escaped the trials and burdens of American civilization, but it was also a place where people met and came together to form a unique American identity. So the West was definitely a very important part of American history, a very important place where American ideals were where they came together and were fleshed out and became much more prominent throughout the rest of the country.